Good morning. My name is Ryan Mick, and I am Dorsey's Labor and Employment Practice Group leader, and it is my distinct privilege this morning to welcome you all to our 12th annual L&E Symposium. We seem to say this every year, but we are doing our jobs in dynamic times. And it's always true. We say it because it's always true. Looking back at just the last 5 years, which is apparently equivalent to eternity, we had deep regulatory uncertainty, then we had political uncertainty, and then we had this little pandemic thing and all that entailed, and then we had the end of the pandemic and more uncertainty, and now we seem to have all of that, plus the distinct possibility of a global economic correction and all that might mean for employers. So I'm glad to see you all here. Seriously, we are grateful that through all that, you have continued to place your trust in us. It's our privilege to go shoulder to shoulder with you, helping you to grow your businesses, helping you to deal with the challenges of having employees. And again, we're grateful for that trust, and today is no exception. We have a great turnout, so welcome to all of you out there in the ether on the web. We are also thrilled for the first time in 3 years to have a live studio audience. So thank you to all of you who braved parking and traffic again to actually come be here with us. We're really excited to have you here today. We have over 925 registrations for today. So again, reflecting the trust that you have put in us over the years and today, thank you. I won't belabor this with any more of an introduction, just a few housekeeping items. If I can transition here, or the group will help me behind the scenes. The materials and attendance forms are available for download from the login and materials emails that were sent on Wednesday from events@dorsey.com. Don't forget to return your completed attendance forms to attendance@dorsey.com. For those of you out on the web, make sure that you click your attendance for each of the sessions so that we know that you are here for each one of those sessions for CLE credits. In terms of CLE credits, we will be applying for CLE and HR credit in all of our usual jurisdictions, so look for more information on that. We have a lot of information to cover today, and frankly, we're kind of scared of what questions from 900 remote attendees would do to us. So we're not going to take time for Q&A today. Please feel free to reach out to the panelists. You'll have all of their contact information in the materials, or if you have a typical Dorsey contact, please feel free to reach out to any of us with questions. For your convenience, particularly those of you out there in the ether, during the symposium, we will put links to download the materials and attendance forms into the chat along with the CLE code. Now, briefly, our agenda for today. We always do our best to make these sessions very practical. And we hope today is no exception. We've really tried to double down on that today. The first session that we have today is called The Escalating Challenges of Remote Work, something near and dear to so many of our hearts these days. Every time I have a conversation about this topic, I learn something new and terrifying. And I think that seems to be the sentiment that so many of our clients have too, that there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns, and a lot of risks associated with remote work, even though everybody wants to do it. So this is a very timely and important session. Then we have 2 sessions that we've grouped under the header of Back to Basics. And I hope none of you take this as an insult. It's not intended to be that at all, but most of the time, nobody can even think these days. You've got so much going on that even dealing with things that used to be routine in the midst of turmoil and uncertainty, we think it's useful to have a refresher on some really basic things and offer you some of the perceptives and things that we've observed over the last couple of years to really make that a practical couple of sessions. Last but not least, we have a seminar on managing differences and diversity in the workplace, focusing on the intersection between employment law and DEI. And we are particularly excited to have our former colleague and now good client, Richard Greifenstein from Target, joining us for that session. We will take short breaks between each session, making adjustments as necessary so that we start on time. And with that, I will turn it over to Katie Carlson, our colleague from Des Moines, who's made the trip up to be with us today to kick off our first session. Katie.
Thanks, Ryan. Well, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be here in person. I see clients in the audience who I'm meeting for the first time in person and not on a screen. And so I'm just delighted to be here and that you've all joined us, and welcome to our folks on Zoom as well. I have Christian Davis and Tim Goodman with me here today. I'm in Dorsey's labor and employment section. Christian and Tim are in tax and benefits. And I could try to explain their practice to you in some sort of very, technical way. But what I will tell you is if anything looks like it's a benefit issue or a tax issue, I just ship it right over to them and think, I'm not going to understand this. I'm going to give it to them. So they're a great resource and just really overlap a lot with our labor and employment practice. And the three of us together have been working together a lot, I would say, in the last probably 4 or 5 months on remote work issues. We're getting a lot of the same questions from clients on remote workers. And so we've really kind of dug into that together from a tax benefit and employment standpoint. So we're going to talk to you about that this morning. There we are. Agenda. So we're going to do a brief overview on taxes, benefits, and employment law. Then we're just going to kind of give you some practical next steps. This is not meant to be a 50-state survey. We do have some specific examples from other states that just sort of are meant to illustrate the quirkiness of this particular topic. But if you are looking at specific states or you have questions about specific states, you definitely want to take a much deeper dive than what we're doing here today. So, before we get started, I think hopefully this presentation will show you that if you go into remote work thinking, oh, we'll just put employees wherever they want and they'll be happy and they'll be on the computer and it'll be fine, and that's all we really need to worry about, that could be very problematic for you. There are a lot of different things to consider when you start expanding your workforce into new states. Still considerations if you already have employees in states, because chances are you may have employees in states, but you're not compliant with those state laws. But even scarier if you're kind of just setting forth on a remote workforce and putting people in states where you've not otherwise operated. So I think the first thing that comes up probably are taxes and benefits. So Christian, do you want to just kind of give us a brief overview of those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And so whenever a client comes to Katie or myself or Tim with a question about remote work or entering a new state with your remote workforce, we typically talk about 3 buckets. Now, it's not entirely clean and perfect, but generally the 3 buckets that end up in the conversation are what consequences will the company face, or what considerations must the company keep in mind if on the individual side. We're talking about payroll taxes, any licensure that the individual may have to have, what are the withholding rules in each state, which can get complex, and as Katie will go into in a second, unemployment, workers' compensation, all of those types of individual specific burdens. Then there is a layer of labor and employment considerations that I certainly can't speak to as an expert, which is why Katie and I work together so much. And those vary, from my understanding, quite a bit state to state. And then third, the consequences of the company itself engaging with the state or in the state. There's a conversation with the client that must be had about what are the facts and specifics of this individual in the state, what duties are they going to be performing, and does that create what we call nexus in the state, which would require some sort of tax or registration or any other consequence in the state for that employer. So that's sort of the parameters of our initial conversations, and that in the tax and benefits side, the first and third buckets there, these are typically what we see. Payroll and taxes, conversations about Erisa if they have Erisa plans, reimbursement for expenses for remote workers. Some states require it, some don't, as we'll get into later. And of course, in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, how does the state's laws affect your benefit plans? considering that decision.
So as Christian said, there are also a lot of employment considerations in a remote workforce. And so what we try to do when clients come to us and say, we're thinking about these 5 states, what do we need to be aware of? We just kind of do this overview. What are the unemployment rules? What are the work comp rules? Are there any wage and hour laws that may be different from the FLSA that we need to be worried about? Employee leave is a big one. There are a lot of states that have certain required leaves, whether it's PTO, whether it's sick time, what that sick time can be used for, what happens when the employee terminates employment. And those are things that, if you're not giving your employees the required employee leave, that could be a legal issue. And so you need to be aware of things like that. Training and policy requirements specifically focused on sexual harassment is another big one. There's a handful of states that require certain kinds of sexual harassment training. Some of them have certain kinds of sexual harassment policies that need to be done by state law. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to operate in one of those states, that you're complying with that. And then there's also just sort of, I would say, the more sort of day-to-day HR things to be aware of, like what happens when they leave, when do they have to get their final paycheck, are they getting a PTO payout, things like that. What can you ask or not ask on applications and interviews? Marijuana legalization is another one that's been impacting clients who have drug testing policies in states where now maybe marijuana is legal, like Minnesota. Or if you're expanding to a state where marijuana is legal, but you're currently not in a state where it's legal, you may need to update your drug testing policies. So that's something we look at. Probably a lesser consideration, but still one to think about, is whether the state has protected classes beyond federal law. And then, just like Christian mentioned, post Dobbs, just kind of looking at what the state landscape might be in light of that decision. So we've been talking a lot about remote work and remote workers. And so, Tim, can you sort of put the boundaries on what we mean when we're talking about that, at least for our presentation today?
Sure. So to try and put some boundaries here, you hear a lot of things about, well, I've got some employees who are working from home, or I've got some employees working remotely. And that can mean a lot of different things. You could have a company that's located, say, in Denver, and people are working from Colorado Springs because they're working from home. You could have a company where they're located in Denver and they're working from Wyoming or Montana. You could have a company where they're headquartered again in Denver and they're working from Costa Rica. Theoretically, all those in a way are remote workers. We're not really going to be talking much about the first category where they're the people in the same state, although some of the issues we'll be going through can come up in that context. And we're not really focused either on people working internationally, although we've had to deal with employers who had questions on that as well. In this issue, it's a really interesting thing. Later on, we've got this whole presentation about the potentially cooling economy. I think a lot of employers are seeing like this dichotomy. There may be some workforce out there that's looking for jobs, but then there's also needs that are going unmet. And you also have employers who are in locations where it's always been difficult to attract someone. So let's say you're an employer and you're located in not the largest 2, 3, 4, 5 cities of the state, but you're located in another city of the state, and you're trying to find a CFO or an IT person or something like that. You've got a great candidate, but they might not want to relocate to you. That's been a challenge for a while with many employers. Specialized talent and other things. And people who have those special skills, I think one of the things people are seeing is they say, can I work remotely? Is this a job where I can do from somewhere else? So our focus is really going to be on people, and we've tried to define it here. So the employer, basically the person's performing services in a state where the employer doesn't have its corporate headquarters. It's not, again, if it's Denver is the corporate headquarters, it's not in the state of Colorado. That employer is working somewhere else. The employer doesn't really have facilities. So let's say we're in Wyoming and they don't really have a brick and mortar site there or something like that. But they found the great IT person who's in Cheyenne and they'd like to use that person. And they say, boy, we should get that person on board and start using them as an employee. And usually it's a limited number of employees. If you're a company and you're looking to open a new facility in Cheyenne, all of a sudden you've got 20, 30, 40 people. You're going to figure out, okay, we got to get the payroll, everything right. This usually comes up a lot, I think, with us where it's like this incremental thing where somebody even in very large organizations, like it's just one person. We need that person. Let's just get this one person. Or it's now two people or something else. And maybe you have 5 or 10 in that state, right? Or maybe you just stay at 1 or 2. But I think what we're talking about, and what we see a lot is you get these situations where there's a hiring need, the employers looked around, they find a person who's in another state or a person applies who they really like, and they're in another state. And you really don't have any operations there, you know, your facilities there, and thus you're not geared up for compliance there. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So again, as it said, we're also just briefly, I'll just say, we're not talking about independent contractors. That's a whole other seminar that'll go for an hour at some point in the future, perhaps, but not that. So, you know, some of the things that get really confusing here too is this isn't always permanent, right? I mean, you look at a number of factors. So sometimes you have a person who might go to another state and they're there to train people for 2 weeks, right? Is that a remote worker? Possibly. You have a person who goes to another state to attend a conference. Is that a remote worker? Possibly. That's something to consider. How long are they going to be there? A week, a day, a month? How much money are they going to earn there? You know, with states with income taxes, there's many states that have sort of this de minimis threshold that, hey, we're not going to tax anybody who earns $1,000 or less or whatever amount in the state. So how much are they going to earn while they're performing services there? And to take one step aside here, we'll get into this more on the payroll tax issue, but one of the considerations is states can tax you both on where you reside and where you perform services, right? So that's a consideration. You also have considerations of what type of job is it. Different states will look at things, and I just use this as an example on the side here, but you know, if you've got a major league sport player coming into your state, they're only going to be there maybe for a day or a few days. They're going to earn a lot of money in those few days. You want to tax them on that, right? So even if you might have a situation where, you know, if you had a person coming in and training and they're getting paid, say, $1,000 that week, maybe that isn't going to get taxed, but you've got this major league player or somebody else who's earning more. The state may have rules about, hey, you have to tax that person. So all these things sort of add to the complexity, but the bottom line here, I think, is when you think about who we're talking about today, generally, I think the people we've been trying to help employers with the most are employees who are working in a state where they normally don't have operations, where they don't really have the compliance system set up, where they may not have the payroll capacity all set up. And then what challenges does that raise for the employer? Payroll taxes. So I gave you a little preview here. Well, one of the biggest questions or comments that comes up, or at least as Christian, I think, is we've got this person, they're working in Illinois. You know, what should we be doing in terms of payroll taxes? Should we be withholding? And sometimes this comes up, you know, unfortunately after the fact. It'd be great if we all had enough time to always think about these things beforehand. But, you know, almost every state has its own different rules about income tax. In a way, I feel like I should have put up a slide here, federalism, its wonders and its difficulties. Everybody who is probably attending this presentation, and at some point we'll talk about this more, paid leave and just all the differences in different little jurisdictions, right? Well, income taxes were maybe the original version of this in a way, because you know you have income taxes where there are some states that don't have an income tax. There are states that have a very low income tax. There are states that have a very high income tax, California, New York, Illinois, Minnesota, et cetera. And so you, as you can probably guess, one of the things you have to be concerned about is especially states with higher income tax rates are probably more motivated to make sure they're collecting the taxes required. But it really doesn't even end there. When you get down to it, counties can have income taxes, cities can have income taxes. I believe in the state of Ohio, practically every county, if not every county, and many cities have their own income taxes. And if you have an employee who's, let's say you're headquartered in Minnesota and you have the perfect IT person, they live in Ohio, are you ready to start withholding county, city, and other income taxes? Is something you have to think about in terms of compliance. Once you look into and say, okay, do we have these sort of taxes? Then you have to say to yourself, well, what are withholding and reporting requirements? Because it's not just, does the state have that tax requirement? It might be, do we have to withhold and report? And again, this may get into how long are we going to have that remote employee in that state? Again, it's one thing if the person is saying, hey, I've got all these IT skills, I'd love to work for you, but I'd like to stay here in Springfield, Ohio, and they're permanent there. But maybe you say, you know what? We've got a client in Springfield, Ohio. We need this person to go work there for 2 weeks or a month to help them get everything set up. that person's working remotely, and you have to still consider then they're performing services in the state of Ohio. Are there taxes that come with that? So those are some of the things we see. At the very bottom of the slide, I won't get into this in super depth, but this is one of the areas that Christian I also get called into, even deferred compensation. You know, states, as everybody has seen, struggle with their budgets from time to time and trying to balance needs. And we have an example here with the state of Minnesota. It used to be, well, I'll give the example here. Let's say you work in the state of South Dakota, and that's where you work for most of your career. You work there for 5 years. You have this wonderful severance plan that says, hey, if you're terminated, we're going to pay you a year's worth of severance. You work 5 years in the state of South Dakota, and then your employer says, can you go work in Minnesota for 1 year, right? And then you come back to South Dakota for another 4 years. So 10% of your time working for this employer was in Minnesota. There's a possibility when you get that severance payment, there's a possibility if you have some deferred compensation or equity, Minnesota can raise its hand and say, hi there, remember that deferred compensation and equity or severance you earned over time? We'd like our piece of that now. Now that it's getting paid out, you owe it to us. And that's a very complicated thing. And not, again, most employers and payroll systems aren't set up to do that. And so there's things like that that come up that can be long range things. It's not even the immediate payroll issues you might have of, hey, this person worked in Minnesota for part of this year, we may have to withhold for part of this year. If they get deferred compensation or equity awards, when you're going ahead and paying them out many years down the road, you may have to say to yourself, should we have withheld some for Minnesota on those deferred compensation or equity awards? And this also comes up in the context of people who are changing jobs, obviously, or changing locations. Let's say you work in Minnesota and you relocate to Florida or something, right? And you're working in Florida. You may have earned things years ago in Minnesota, but you may still owe taxes on those. So those are the things where they can come up. I'd say, especially with deferred compensation and equity awards, this is sort of like a yin and the egg. On the bright side, it doesn't affect as many employees, but the people it affects are your most senior leadership. So you probably want to be working to make sure that you get that right.
So,
Please,
Katie. I was going to say my takeaway then, Christian, is Ohio's bad and we shouldn't send remote work. Christian's from Ohio and he loves Ohio, so I could not resist that.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't word it that
Can you
way.
talk about payroll employment taxes for us?
Yeah, so I guess the first step is understanding whether or not the company needs to take care with these income taxes and these payroll and withholding on the taxes. There are a number of states that have de minimis thresholds. So if your company or if your client wants to go into a new state, it's possible that the individual working remotely from that state has income tax, but the company itself does not have a withholding obligation. Of course, there's a second conversation about whether it's in the company's best interest to withhold anyway to prevent any sort of disgruntled employee from being upset that they now have a large tax bill because there was no withholding throughout the year. But the reality is that in a lot of states, or at least some states, there is a de minimis threshold for this withholding requirement. So you may or may not need to withhold as an employer on $1 paid to your employee in this new state X. Down at the bottom of the page, we have a couple of payroll-like taxes. The Washington Cares Fund and the California Paid Family Leave. Those are taxes that are applied to payroll in sort of the same way that you would have the FICA taxes apply. They sit somewhere, I think, in between income and payroll taxes, which is why I call them payroll-like. You may or may not know, Washington does not have an income tax, I guess, as Tim said last slide. And so one way around that is this Washington Cares Fund. And so the point of pointing out these two specifically is to suggest that in these conversations that we have with clients, there are some, I think, landmines or bear traps that we have to keep our eyes out for, that we can advise for clients, because every state's unique. And these are just a couple of the examples of that. So as I mentioned, sort of up top, we have I guess, third bucket, corporate taxes. And so corporate taxes vary, the laws vary quite a bit by state. What we're talking about is what constitutes, depending on the state, what constitutes doing business in the state or transacting business in the state. Those are typically the two phrases that are used. In either event, they're describing nexus in the state. Typically, or in my experience, the vast majority of states, having one employee working remotely does not in and of itself create nexus. It would not require some sort of allocation of the company's income to that state based solely on an individual working from their laptop, from their living room, for your company. That being said, this also is fairly fact specific. If the employee in the state working remotely has some sort of customer facing job, if what they're doing is really value added to the bottom line, if they're generating profits, then the state might say there is nexus in that state. If the employee is an accountant and is just working internally for the company that happens to be headquartered and operated in another state, then there probably isn't nexus. But this is a conversation that companies need to have, and to determine whether or not they need to register with the state, they need to file corporate tax returns with the state, and to make quarterly payments with the state, just because they have one or a few remote workers in this new state.
So while we're not doing, as I said, a 50-state survey, I did want to give some specific examples, and we've got specific examples coming up on the next few slides of kind of how this plays out in real life. So not talking so much in theory, but giving you examples of, okay, well, how is this operating in different states? So in terms of wage and hour issues, obviously, if you do a lot of wage and hour, you know about the FLSA, you probably know about your state's wage and hour laws. I would say most states track with the FLSA, but some have different exemption rules. And so that's something that you would need to look at. Some rules or some states have specific rules about overtime, who gets overtime and when, that differs from the FLSA. And so you obviously want to make sure that you're aware of those. The test for determining whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor can vary by state. And so if you typically hire independent contractors and you're used to doing that under one state's law and you feel comfortable that you're properly classifying them, you would want to make sure that if you're going to keep doing that in other states, that you still meet that state's test. Pay transparency and disclosure is sort of a topic on the rise. I think everybody's probably talking about Colorado and what do we do in Colorado and how can we avoid Colorado, because they have all these pay transparency and job posting requirements. And I would say, at least in my experience and with Rebecca, we've worked with clients who just are sort of a little bit in Colorado, and they've already gotten notices from the Department of Labor in Colorado saying, we looked at your job postings and they're not compliant. So that is a fairly robust enforcement mechanism out in Colorado. There are certainly, I think, good legal questions about whether there's jurisdiction for Colorado to go after out-of-state employers on those kinds of things. But unless you want to be the test case, our advice is to go ahead and do what they say you need to do. New York recently passed a pay transparency law too, and so I think we're going to start seeing that in other states. So that's something to be aware of. I talked a little bit at the beginning about the payout of accrued but unused PTO on termination. That's something that you want to look at. And then, of course, the timing of the last paycheck. And I just gave a few examples here of how this differs. So, for example, in states like Iowa or Florida, there is no rule about the last paycheck. And so you just pay out on the next regular payday. In Utah, it depends on why the employee is terminated. And same with Texas, although you'll see in Utah, it's a matter of hours. In Texas, it's a matter of days. And so those are nuances that you just need to figure out what they are in the states where you might have workers.
So near and
Okay.
dear to a lawyer who came from Ohio and is now practicing in Minnesota, is the conversation about whether or not you need new licensing or you need to report licensing in a state if you have a remote worker working there. Certainly this, again, is a conversation about the specifics, about the duties that the employee will be performing in the state. But this conversation includes both the licensing for an individual. Does the new state of Minnesota respect my Ohio bar license? Or do I have to apply for a new one, reciprocity, et cetera? Also, there are changes between the states, there are differences between the states on what sort of filings companies or practices that require licensing need to file with the state to make sure that any individuals performing such licensed duties in the state are properly licensed, even if the state does respect the other state's license. And so while this is a specialized conversation that might not be required with all clients, it's certainly something that the companies need to keep their eye on if they perform services that would require licensing in some or all states.
And I would just add on that if you are employing employees who have licensing requirements and they have employment contracts, that you should make sure the employment contract reflects the licensing requirements of the state. You sort of have a boilerplate agreement that you use. It may not be compliant in a state if a state has some quirky licensing laws. So just make sure you're updating those. So for those of you following along in the materials, you'll see that the next two slides, while they have different titles, are actually the same slide. So I'm going to cover work comp and unemployment insurance together. And the work comp will just be a total surprise because it's not in the materials accidentally. So the considerations for these from a practical standpoint are just to be aware of when do you have to get work comp coverage in the state if you have employees there. And similarly, when do you need to get, when are you paying in for unemployment compensation? Just like the final paycheck rules that differ from state to state, there is some differentiation in terms of when you have to cover someone for purposes of work comp and when you need to register for unemployment and pay into the unemployment compensation fund. Some states say one employee is enough. Some states say you have to have 3 employees. Some states like Colorado, we're kind of picking on Colorado now, but have this very sort of intricate, calculation of how many hours and how much they're working. So you just need to really kind of look at the state's laws. And then also specifically with work comp, don't assume that a work comp policy that covers Minnesota employees and complies with Minnesota law, that you can just add another state's employees to that policy. I would say with all of the states that say, if you have X number of employees, you need to have work comp insurance here. The law also says, and it needs to be a policy that's compliant under our state laws. Now, of course, it could be that Minnesota and Colorado have the same coverage requirements, and so you can just add the person, but you'd want to ask your insurance broker to make sure that you have a policy that is compliant in the multiple states. Employees can file for unemployment in any state they choose. So if they're working half the year in Minnesota and half the year somewhere else, and they're going to file for unemployment, they could pick either of the states. But ultimately, the laws and the payment will come out of the state in which they worked. And then a lot of these, there's interstate reciprocal coverage arrangements where a lot of these, the State Department of Labor or Workforce Development or whatever they call them in the states will say, here's this central registry where you can register for all of your employees, kind of make it less of a headache so you're not registering in multiple places. So now we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, Erisa.
I think that's right.
I would say Erisa falls into the category of like, I see the letters and I just immediately send it over to these two. So what's Erisa and why do we care about it for remote work?
Yeah, so Erisa is a federal law that was passed in 1974. So at this point, it's sort of old news. But the environment around Erisa stays fresh because, as we will get into in future slides here, there are state laws that are really up in the air whether they're preempted or not by Erisa. And so, what is Erisa preemption? Well, under Erisa, with certain exceptions that Tim will get into in a second, states cannot pass laws that relate to health and welfare laws that are governed by Erisa. I'm sort of defining Erisa preemption by saying it's preempted by Erisa. But there are exceptions to it. And certainly not all plans are covered by Erisa. Here are a few examples of what plans are or are not covered by Erisa. Very commonly 401k plans, defined benefit plans, those are Erisa plans. Health and welfare plans, which is sort of important for the next few slides for this conversation. Health and welfare plans are typically Erisa plans, with the exception of the plans listed at the bottom, the dependent care assistance plans, the DCAPs, or payroll continuation plans. And so if a plan is covered by Erisa, a state at least has a more difficult time to sort of layer on more requirements or make the plans, the administration of the plans, more onerous on the clients.
But maybe just following up a little bit on what Christian said. So why does Erisa matter in this context? It's because, it's not really possible for a state. So let's say that California said, we want all of our 401k plans to include an employee loan feature. They can't do that, right? We want all life insurance still in the state to do something. They might be able to do that, and I'll explain that in a second here. We want this or that or the other thing. So when you get to having these employees in different states, you have to worry about, well, what benefits are we providing these employees in all of these states? It's not just what state laws apply, it's what benefits are we providing to them? And what are we required to provide to them, in essence, in some states, right? So you have, just again, by way of example, the city and county of San Francisco requires a certain payment in to provide certain health coverage for people in that area. And if you meet certain requirements, you don't have to. Otherwise, you have to make a payment into a fund to make sure that people have health coverage in the city and county of San Francisco, by way of example. So one of the reasons to understand Erisa at least a little bit is to understand what is it that a county or a city or a state or somebody might require of us in terms of benefits, so real quickly here, there's not going to be a test at the end. However, your next trivia night, if you remember this, you can go to HR trivia. Okay, so basically, Erisa preempts state laws. Great. And if Congress had stopped there, Christian and I would maybe have even more work because everybody would say, thank God for Erisa, can they extend it to paid leave? But they didn't stop there. They said, however, Erisa does not exempt or preempt state insurance, banking, and securities laws. And insurance is the one that comes up the most often, right? So states can regulate what's required of life insurance policies in their state. If you issue a health insurance plan, what's required of that health insurance plan? If you issue a long-term disability insurance coverage, what's required of that? As you might guess, the differences maybe between states and life insurance and others aren't as big, but when it comes to health insurance, it can be very significant. Some states have massive requirements of if you're issuing an insured plan, what's required in that state. So let's say you're an employer and you've got about 250 employees, you probably have an insured health plan because you're not quite to the self-insured level yet. And you now have an employee who's in the fine state of Illinois, you've never had someone there before. The state of Illinois has a lot of requirements. You might have to go to your health insurance company and say, are we meeting those requirements? We've got an employee in that state or things like that. Other considerations generally is that Erisa does not preempt generally applicable state criminal law. That comes a little bit into context when employers are now thinking about what we need to do in the context of maybe the Dobbs decision if we're trying to help or do different changes to our health plan. So Erisa preemption actually matters a fair amount, and generally Erisa preemption helps employers. If you, as a general rule of thumb, with respect to your retirement plans, Erisa is going to preempt most state laws, which is very helpful. When it comes to health insurance, if you have a self-insured health plan, it's going to go ahead and preempt state laws there as well. Again, generally very helpful. But there's still some things you have to do even with those plans, and we're going to talk about those in a second here. Why don't we go to the next one, Katie? An example here, again, just telling about how different things work here. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on in terms of sometimes states can impose reporting requirements or taxes or other things, even if they're not affecting direct benefits. But states do and have for a number of years been taking more of a proactive stance in affecting benefit plans. And what is really preempted gets a little complicated. The Supreme Court here's an Erisa case almost every year. That's kind of amazing, actually, because that shows you how complicated the statute is. And these are just a few examples of when they found things were preempted or were not. And just as by way of example here, I won't get into these, but states of late have been trying to regulate pharmacy benefit managers and questions about them and can they control what pharmacies maybe you go to. And as you might guess, with the small pharmacies of the state, they may go to their legislature and say, hey, we want to regulate this or help us and prevent it from having these big benefit managers doing certain things. So these questions come up and the Supreme Court tries to deal with them. But ERISA matters because it does matter what type of benefit structure you have. And again, where your remote employees are working, because there are some states, as Christian will get to much later in the presentation, much higher regulation, some states much lower regulation.
So we're going to kind of pivot a little bit to some more specific state laws, Tim, with regard to not only expense reimbursement, but just some other quirky laws that people should maybe have on their radar.
Yeah, exactly. So when you have remote workers, we're going to just highlight now, as he was saying, some different state laws, give you some examples so you get a little more flavor and go from there. State laws about expense reimbursement. Some states require you, and this is almost this is where it really a crossover both between employment law and benefits and taxation again. But some states have provisions that say, hey, if you require an employee to incur certain expenses, you have to reimburse the employee for that. And we have examples here of North Dakota, Iowa, South Dakota, just to give a few examples. But then the question comes up, what is it we might have to reimburse? Do we have to reimburse, the home internet if they're working remotely? Do we have to reimburse equipment if we need some ergonomic equipment or something? What is it we have to reimburse? That's something you could see yourself having to worry about. You can go to the next one, Katie. Christian, I'm going to talk about just a few examples of different taxes and things the employer may see in terms of state. As many of you may know, the state of Washington, a few years back, it decided that, and you'll hear this theme again and again, states are getting concerned about the aging population is maybe how I should phrase this general theme. And so they're trying to take steps that they think will help them and their budgets in the long run in terms of addressing the aging population. So with respect to Washington, it said, we don't think people are really prepared to have stays with long-term care. So we're going to enact this long-term care support rule that people will be required to pay in a certain portion of their income. It'll create this fund. Then when they need the long-term care assistance, it'll be there for them, right? It was originally supposed to be effective at the start of this year. Due to a number of issues that came up and a lot of pushback, the legislature eventually pushed off the effective date until the middle of next year. There's still a lot of open questions about it, but this isn't a seminar on this law, but it's to highlight you can get these individual laws in states where they're requiring you to withhold certain things based on employment. Christian, Illinois?
Yeah, so the next two slides are really more about disclosure than a specific tax. The state of Illinois last summer passed the Illinois Consumer Coverage Disclosure Act. This law, I suspect, will eventually go through the courts to figure out whether it is preempted by ERISA or not, but it might take a while. The reason it might take a while is because right here at the bottom, as you can see, the penalties are actually quite low. I think this is sort of a feature and not a bug for the state. Certainly if the most expensive penalty that you're going to require from a company is $5,000 in a given year, then it sort of decreases the incentive for them to challenge it under Erisa in the courts. Now, what is the Illinois Consumer Coverage Disclosure Act? What it says is that companies that employ workers in Illinois must provide a comparison of the healthcare that is offered to the employees, whether or not they elect it, against the benchmark coverage set by Illinois. This does not require the companies to meet or exceed the benchmark coverage that is set by Illinois. It only requires the employers to disclose that comparison to the individuals. Now, this has a couple of complications that we have addressed with clients. First, what happens when you have employees in multiple states? Are you providing the benchmark disclosure to all of the employees? You only have to provide it to the employees in Illinois. How are you disclosing it is a question that comes up that we've received from clients. Do you have to provide them something physical direct to the client? Is posting it on an intranet page sufficient? Email, etc. And then finally, again, what are the odds that this is preempted by Erisa? And the reality is that we think, at least from conversations that we've had at Dorsey, that this is likely preempted. That being said, it is not really creating any requirements of the healthcare coverage other than to disclose to the individuals. Another disclosure law that was passed that's state specific is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Now, I am certainly not an expert in in privacy or in any sort of data space, but I liken this to an alternative to Europe has the GDPR. California Consumer Privacy Act has sort of those same protections or something like those protections for employees. What this does is it requires employers to disclose to employees the data that they're collecting and how they are distributing it or using that with third parties. It also requires employers to sign compliant contracts with vendors that are going to be handling employee data and employee information. This certainly at least attempts to protect individuals and employees from having their data unknowingly shared with other parties. But it is certainly a consideration that employers need to have when they're entering the state of California, because it does create an administrative burden in compliance and in making sure that you are keeping up with this, especially if you haven't already been doing that for other employees or for other states where you're working.
And I'll just briefly add to that last note, Dorsey has multiple employment law attorneys in the state of California who help us with those issues as they come up, and so that's how we go about doing them. I'm briefly going to talk about a couple of things here. Health coverage reporting. This is another example of these little nits, and what I think hopefully want to have you take away is every state you're in, then you have to start going through this whole little checklist of do we have to worry about these different rules, right? And so health coverage reporting, over the last 5 years, a number of states have adopted rules similar to the reporting of the Form 1095-C to the federal government, where they've been interested in getting reports about which of their citizens are covered under health insurance. And there's a quick list here. I'm not going to go through them, but in essence, that's another requirement, right? If you have employees, say in the state of New Jersey or the state of California, you might have to also submit that. And that's another little aspect of compliance that you have to worry about if you have people in those states. Why don't we go on to the next one here, Kate?
So I mentioned earlier that leave laws are something that is kind of a hot topic when we're talking about remote work, and I won't spend too much time sort of going through the laundry list of different leave laws that you should consider, but I do want to highlight earned sick time on this slide just as another sort of real world example of where the differences can occur and what they look like. So, and it goes down even to the city level. So Minnesota itself does not have a specific sick and safe time rule, but employees in the city of Minneapolis are entitled to sick and safe time under certain circumstances. And there's an ordinance that says when the sick time can be used, what it can be used for, depending on the size of employer, if it's paid or unpaid. So that's an example of when you're looking at employees moving in the states, that especially for things like leave laws, you also need to look at exactly where they are going to be located. I know the city of Philadelphia has some specific requirements that are different from Pennsylvania state requirements. Arizona and Nevada are another couple of examples. So Arizona is fairly simple. It's just 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, not too hard to calculate. But then you'll see Nevada has this sort of weird calculation on a decimal based on how big of an employer you are. So those are things that you need to keep in mind as you have employees moving around. Tim?
Sure. So retirement plan mandates. To give, this is yet again, in states being concerned, I'd say, about the population they have, and are they going to be ready for retirement? What are we going to do with people retire and have no income? Is that going to be, again, a drain on state resources? And so a growing trend, and this has been going on for a number of years now, is states starting to enact their own state-run IRAs or retirement plans, not for state employees, but for workers in the state who don't have access to, say, a 401k plan. And the rules vary greatly. And you can go on to the next slide here, which is our teeny weeny font slide, I'll call it, as small as we can get. We tried to give you the whole list here, but you can see it's quite a number of states. And there are a number of states that have just taken action. So Hawaii is a new state that got added to this list recently. Delaware is a new state that got added to this list. And much like the Washington Long-Term Cares Fund and things like that, here, this is actually caught on even more, and the rules vary state by state by state. And you even at the federal level, you see some legislation, the Secure Act and Secure Act 2.0 are trying to cover more people who are working fewer hours under employer retirement plans. So there's sort of convergence there. But again, what we're really trying to point out with all these examples are, it's really hard. I mean, in a second, Christian is going to go into more of a beautiful color map of the country, but it's really hard here to have people in multiple jurisdictions. And if you're going to do that, because it's like this trend, we have all these people out here, we need these talents and things. But again, with some positions, it's hard to fill. It might be because we're located. Where are they located? If you look at the list here, you'll see at the very bottom, Washington, Seattle itself, the city has passed one of these rules and basically said, hey, if the state of Washington doesn't implement this, we're going to implement our own citywide retirement plan to take care of people who live in the city of Seattle. New York City, same thing. So it's the problem is it's not even a state by state look, it's a city by city look. And when you look at everything we're talking about here today, we wish we could have just this instant checklist for every client that would say, you know, I'm thinking of basing a person out of Bloomington, Illinois. What do I have to worry about in the city of Bloomington, Illinois? But there's so many different factors. It's almost like you have to go through and look at a number of issues. There's not even a quick, even if there were a 50-state survey, there's probably not a 150 city survey of the state of Illinois or something like that. And so these are some of the things to consider, again, in terms of where are we going to allow people to work? And I think I'm transitioning a little bit here, maybe early, but we're really, one of the things I think you have to start thinking about is if we're hiring people, if we have these remote workers, if we need them, what sort of policies might we put around it? How might we go ahead and try and control that a little bit? But Katie, you have some other employment issues you want to discuss as well.
Yep. So I said in the beginning that leave requirements and sexual harassment training were kind of two big hot topic items when we're talking about remote workers. These are the states listed here who have some type of mandatory sexual harassment training and or policy requirements. They differ from state to state. And so if you're thinking about moving workers into one of these states, hiring workers in one of these states where you have employees there, you should check out what their sexual harassment policies and training requirements are. These again vary from state to state. So some of them say managers need training and it needs to be 3 hours every year. Other employees need training and it's 2 hours every other year. And then other states don't have any hourly requirements and just say you need to do some sort of training that covers these specific topics. I have found that a lot of these states, particularly California, I think Illinois and New York, for sure, they on their website, whatever agency governs employment, civil rights in the state, they will have sample policies and say, if you're an employer in this state, here's a policy that would comply with our requirements. Here's a training module that would comply with our requirements. And so I've kind of advised clients, like, there's no better way to comply than to use the state's own policies. And so be aware of those, go find them. And I think at least use them as a starting point of knowing, okay, if we just take this from the New York website and, make it our own and stick it in our handbook, we should be good on compliance. So something else to think about. Other employment considerations, again, prohibited inquiries, what can you and can you not ask people about in the hiring process? I think we're kind of all aware of, under the ADA, these are the questions we can't ask, and this is when we can ask them. Ban the box ordinances and laws are rising in popularity. And we had a recent quirky questions blog post about ban the box laws and what they are and where they're at. So check that out if that's something you're interested in. And that, of course, deals with criminal history in employment application inquiries. As I said, marijuana legalization can complicate company-wide drug testing policies, and you may need to think about revising your policy for locations, specific locations, or just doing an overhaul altogether if you start getting employees in different states where marijuana might be legal in some states and not others. And then obviously protected classes beyond federal law. Like I said, that's not as big of one, but something to be aware of. So
Katie, briefly, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, and you're just giving what I call the short list here of maybe the most popular things. You have all sorts of other issues, non-compete rules.
Yep.
States vary by non-compete rules, a whole host of employment laws you could go through. Again, we could have a very, very small font slide with just the rule issue after issue after issue in employment law that you and your colleagues deal with. But states have different rules for all those topics. And so it's trying to work through all those different topics and obviously talking to someone like you.
Yeah. So I think we've been seeing clients in sort of one of two camps when they're talking about remote work. It's either we've got employees who are in these states or who want to go to these states. What do? They're already there. Help us get in compliance as quickly as possible. Or we're thinking about allowing people to work remotely. What states should we avoid? What are the good states? What do we need to be thinking about? And that kind of depends, I would say, for the second one. So for the first one, you've already got employees there. Contact your trusted Dorsey attorney and start getting in compliance to make sure you're doing everything right. When you're looking at expanding, but you haven't yet done so, I think it's really kind of, what is your goal? I mean, and I think that really will sort of guide the decision-making process. So if your goal is employee retention, we want to let our employees go where they want to go. We have a huge staffing issue and we're willing to hire people anywhere. Tell us the states where it's easiest to do that. That's one consideration. And Christian, I sort of forced him to make that cool map in there because he'd been verbally explaining this sort of, well, you go up north and then you go south a little bit and then east. And so I said, make a map of it. People will love that. So he'll explain that in a minute, but that's one approach. But you should also think about, are you a relatively conservative company with conservative employees? And, we kind of like to expand into states that sort of mirror that culture of ours, mirror our approach to it. Or on the flip side, are you a progressive company that really likes to be out ahead of issues and you want to only be in states where, state laws sort of mirror that are out ahead of things? And so those are kinds of things to look at too. And I would say that's kind of the advantage of being in the second group, which is we haven't yet expanded, but we're trying to figure out where we would like to expand to. So I think the first step is sort of, well, what's our goal here? And then you can kind of figure out what states you could operate in order to reach that goal. So Christian, do you kind of want to explain the colors on this map and sort of?
Yeah, Absolutely. So hopefully two things have become abundantly clear over the last hour. The three of us and the lawyers at Dorsey have done a lot of work in many, if not all of these states, trying to wrap our heads around the different laws and the different implications of having remote workers in a new state or expanding to a new state. Also, I hope it is abundantly clear that these conversations require so many balls in the air, and keeping track of so many different priorities, some of which may be more important or less important to a specific client based on how many employees they want to hire in a given state, what the employees would be paid in a given state, the jobs that they'll be doing. And so both of those are said to deliver the message that this is not a scientific map to show you the correct answer for where to send your employees. What this map is a very rough estimation based on all the work that the three of us and other lawyers at Dorsey have done, and all of the conversations that we've had with clients, and where it seems like the least hurdles to employing remote workers or expanding your workforce into these states are. All of that said, really what we have been telling clients is if you sort of draw a line immediately to the east of the Pacific, and so that would exclude California, Oregon, Washington, and then run that over to the Mississippi River. Those seem to be the least burdensome states to hire new individuals, to have remote workers, both from the employment and often the tax and business, the corporate side. The exception, as you can see, the island in the shade of light blue is Colorado. The darker the color of purple, I said blue just a second ago. I must be
colorblind.
I'm not colorblind. As you can tell by my green jacket.
Right.
So yes, the darker the shade of purple, the more burdensome, very generally speaking, we believe the states are. That being said, as Katie said just a minute ago, if you're intent on having employees in Pennsylvania, even though Pennsylvania is a dark purple or dark blue, depending on how you look at it, state on this map, you should not necessarily be discouraged just because there are more requirements.
Yeah, I want to stress this. We're not choosing favorite states or not favorite states. We're talking here about what are the level of complexity and compliance you should be prepared for. How should I phrase this? Approximately 20% of the United States population is in the state of California. Does that mean that you don't put anybody there because it's got a higher compliance level? Probably not. If you're a business and you want to grow, you may need that. I don't know what percentage of the country's tech workers are in California, but if you're looking for IT people, again, you may say to yourself, it's worth the compliance effort because that will increase our job pool and things like that. It's just that when you look at states, there are states, and again, Christian tried to put this and condense it all together, but you think to yourself, okay, does the state have an income tax? Do they have these other CARES funds or other taxes? What's the level of employment law difficulty in working with Canadian colleagues and things like that? So if you're hiring remotely, I think where we're going with this, and we can even go on to the next step slide a little bit, is you probably want to think are you going to implement some sort of a policy? I think trying to get ahead of having your people who are in your talent acquisition area, just hiring people here or there remotely and not having a policy, that's where the problems start to rise. And you may say to yourself, maybe we do want a policy. And Katie, do you want to talk more than about that?
Yeah, so I was going to say, if you are in one of those purple states or you have workers who really want to be in those states, do not despair. It's not, we can help you through that. And if it feels overwhelming, it might be a little overwhelming, but you just kind of have to start from the beginning, which is, okay, what are the states? If we need to register, let's get registered. If we've got workers there, let's make sure we've got work comp and unemployment in line. And then just sort of go from there and say, okay, what else do we need to do now to make sure that we're compliant? I also think, excuse me, that a remote work policy is important to sort of set out the parameters of, okay, well, we are in this state, we will have workers in this other state, But those workers are still subject to our policies. These are the expectations of those workers. I think we've done a lot of those sort of, I think during the pandemic with work from home. And you just need to think about, okay, is our work from home policy sufficient to cover workers in other states? Or do we need to sort of maybe do an addendum to that to cover the remote workers? And I feel like we're being played off the stage. A song or something?
Here comes the hook. All right. Katie and Tim and Christian, thank you very much. Informative and entertaining as always. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So go get some coffee, use the restroom, whether that's in the back of the room or in your kitchen at home. And we will be back. This is a shorter break. This is just 5 minutes. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.